He didn't say a word that morning, but the husky beside him felt everything. The grief he carried, the fear he hid, and the strange pull that led them both to the abandoned cabin in the snow. And when Willow pressed her head gently against his hand, Ezra Mallory finally understood. Contentious warnings don't need a voice, and some destinies begin with a silence that only a loyal heart can hear. Winter had settled deep into the Montana high country, the kind that smothered sound and turned the sprawling shoulders of Lone Aspen Ridge into a pale, endless ocean of white, where every gust of wind carried the cold weight of a wilderness older than any man who dared to live beneath it. On mornings like this, the mountains looked carved from bone, quiet, immovable, holding secrets the world had long since forgotten. Ezra Mallory stood in the thick of it now, his breath curling like smoke through the frigid air as he made his way up the narrowing trail, his boots crunching softly against the crusted snow. He was in his early 40s, tall the way older pines stood tall, weathered but unbroken, with a build hardened by years of army service. A faded scar cut across his left cheek, a pale memory of a night he no longer spoke about. His dark hair, streaked faintly with silver, brushed the collar of the worn canvas jacket he preferred over anything newer. He carried himself like a man who had forgotten how to belong anywhere, moving through the world with a quiet restraint that came from losing too much and surviving anyway. But today, he wasn't entirely alone. Pacing a half step ahead was Willow, his white-gray husky whose thick winter coat shimmered beneath the morning light like frost on river stone. At 5 years old, she was in the prime of her strength, keen-eyed, sharp-eared, and bound to Ezra in a way that went beyond simple companionship. Willow had served beside him through the last years of his deployment. She was the only creature who had seen the weight in his chest without demanding he explain it. People who met her often joked she seemed to understand emotions better than humans did. Ezra never laughed at that. It felt too close to the truth. As they reached the ridge overlook, Ezra paused, scanning the valley below, content in the silence, but sensing the familiar ache of past ghosts settling on his shoulders. Tall Pine Junction, the little town tucked 20 miles behind them, felt like a world away now. Just yesterday he'd stood in its dusty courthouse, handing over $600 for the deed to a long-abandoned cabin no one else wanted to claim. Folks in town had exchanged glances when he raised his hand to bid, their whispers trailing after him like uneasy smoke. That place isn't right. People who go up there don't stay long. Yet the moment he heard the auctioneer say, Lone Aspen Ridge, something unexplainable stirred inside him. A quiet pull, steady and insistent, like a voice calling from the distance he couldn't name. And Ezra answered. Now, as he and Willow continued toward the property, the trail grew stranger with every step. A massive pine had fallen across the entrance road, but the cut of the trunk was too clean, too deliberate to be an accident of nature. A few yards beyond it, a barbed wire fence sagged at an odd angle, posts shoved inward as if someone had dragged something heavy through on purpose. Ezra slowed, studying the pattern with the same instinct that had kept him alive overseas. Willow halted too, ears pivoting sharply. She let out a low rumble, not fear but awareness, before pressing on. When the cabin finally came into view through the trees, it stood like a forgotten skeleton of frontier days. Gray logs, sunk with age, the chimney rising at a slight lean, and the roof blanketed in a thin layer of snow and greenish moss. The windows were hollow and dark, staring outward like empty eyes. Willow stopped dead in her tracks, her gaze locked on the stone chimney, her muscles tightening under her fur, and a high, soft whine escaped her throat, a sound Ezra had only heard when something was deeply wrong. He touched her neck gently. "Easy, girl," he murmured, but his own breath felt heavier now. He approached the cabin cautiously, boots creaking over the frozen boards of the porch. Before he reached the door, the faint sound of running water drifted from beyond the clearing. Willow's ears twitched. Ezra followed the sound and rounded the cabin's far edge and froze. A young woman knelt near the stream, her gloved hands breaking ice along the bank. She was bundled in a dark green winter coat, her auburn hair escaping in loose curls from beneath her wool hat, cheeks flushed pink by the cold. When she stood and turned, her expression flickered from surprise to something more guarded. "You must be the one who bought this place," she said, her voice carrying a soft steadiness that contrasted with the harsh winter air. "I'm Harper Quinn." Ezra nodded, offering his name in return. Up close, Harper looked like someone shaped more by purpose than fragility. Her brown eyes held both intelligence and a quiet sorrow, the kind that didn't fade with time. She brushed melting ice from her gloves. "I didn't expect anyone to move in. Not after what happened here." "People in town mentioned something," Ezra said, careful but curious. Harper hesitated, glancing at the cabin as though measuring how much to reveal. "The man who lived here before? He wasn't chased off by snow or storms. He disappeared after he started uncovering something he shouldn't have." Ezra frowned. "Disappeared?" 15 years ago, she said softly. "And this place has been wrong ever since." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't push, but something in Harper's eyes tugged at him, a mix of warning, grief, and an unexpected warmth, subtle but unmistakable, that eased a corner of the cold inside him. Willow sniffed Harper's hand, tail giving a slow, cautious wag. That alone told Ezra she wasn't a threat. After Harper returned to her survey equipment by the stream, Ezra led Willow back to the cabin and pushed open the door. A wave of cold air washed over them, thick with the scents of old wood, dust, and the faint mineral tang of long-dead fire pits. The place was abandoned, yes, but not empty. A ceramic mug sat on the center table, rim faintly stained as if someone had set it down and never returned. A heavy wool coat hung behind the door, one pocket bulging with something too deliberate to be forgotten. Ezra's chest tightened. People didn't leave this kind of detail behind unless something stopped them. Willow's reaction was immediate. She walked past him slowly, tail stiff, nose tilted toward the large stone hearth dominating the far wall. Halfway across the room, her fur rose in a sharp ridge along her spine. Then she stepped forward and began to claw gently but intently at one specific seam between the stones. Ezra crouched beside her. "There?" She whined, pressing her paw into the crack. Ezra fetched a small pry bar from his pack and wedged it into the seam. The moment he applied pressure, the stone gave a hollow, unnatural sound, not the dull thud of solid masonry, but the echo of hidden space. His pulse kicked. With a careful pull, he lifted the edge, revealing a dark cavity beneath. The lantern light flickered across a metal-bound wooden box, the surface etched with letters that sent a prickle down his arms. ASR 2009. Aspen Ridge Survey? Arthur Sloan Research? The initials meant something, though the meaning hovered just out of reach. He reached down to lift it, but a sharp gasp at the doorway made him freeze. Harper stood there, pale against the snow-lit frame, eyes wide with recognition and dread. "Ezra," she whispered, stepping forward as if approaching a grave. "You can't stay here alone tonight. Anyone who's come close to that box, they've vanished. All of them." Willow growled then, low, warning, directed not at Harper but at the tree line beyond the window, as though something unseen had shifted in the woods. Ezra rose slowly, the cold from the hidden space seeping into his bones, and felt it. Not fear, exactly, but the certainty that whatever had drawn him to Lone Aspen Ridge was no coincidence. And standing there between Harper's trembling breath and Willow's unwavering stance, he knew this was only the beginning. The night the ridge chose its people. The box on the table looked small enough to ignore if a man wanted to keep his life simple, but Ezra Mallory had never been that kind of man, not really, and the cabin seemed to know it. The fire in the hearth burned low, throwing a thin amber light across the metal-banded wood, across Harper Quinn's pale fingers clenched tight around the edge of the table, across Willow's watchful eyes as the Husky sat like a silver statue at Ezra's side. Outside, the last color was bleeding out of the Montana sky, turning Lone Aspen Ridge into a dark silhouette against a bruised horizon. Ezra worked the clasp with steady hands that had once diffused bombs and dressed battlefield wounds. Compared to that, a small lock felt almost polite. When the latch finally sprang with a soft metallic sigh, Harper flinched as if something long buried had just exhaled. Ezra opened the lid. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old leather and chemicals. A journal lay on top, its cover dark brown, edges softened by years of use. He picked it up and felt an indentation where the pen had bitten hard into the last pages. Beneath the journal were folded maps, layered with circles and handwritten notes, and tucked neatly in straw were small glass vials filled with a black, viscous liquid that clung to the sides like oil. Harper reached for the journal, her breath shallow. "May I?" she asked, though her eyes were already tracing the familiar handwriting visible at the edges. Ezra nodded, sliding it to her, and watched as she flipped through its pages with a familiarity that told him this moment was less discovery and more confirmation of a fear she'd carried alone for too long. "It's Arthur's," she whispered. "Arthur Sloan. He and I worked together years ago, environmental surveys, water studies across the northern valleys. He was the one who taught me that a river remembers everything done to it." Her fingers trembled as she turned another page. The entries shifted from observational notes, clarity levels, pH readings, wildlife sightings, to angrier, frantic lines about trucks moving at night, barrels unloaded by men who avoided eye contact, strange headaches in nearby families who drank from the creeks. Harper read aloud a line that made the cabin feel smaller. "They are poisoning the valley. If I disappear, the water will tell the story for me." On the last page, scrawled so hard the ink cut into the paper, were words that made her voice break. "They're not just mining under the ridge. They're dumping what they don't want anyone to see. They think winter will hide it. They think the snow will keep it quiet. But snow melts." Harper swallowed, blinking fiercely before the tears could fall, and closed the journal with both hands, as if she had just shut the door on a ghost. Ezra studied the map beneath it, tracing red circles around streams and springs he had unknowingly driven past on his way here. The vials were labeled with dates and coordinates that matched the map, and even without a lab he knew what they meant. Evidence. The kind people killed for when paper alone wasn't enough. "You knew him well?" he asked quietly. Harper nodded. "Arthur believed the land could be both beautiful and just if people with power were forced to answer for what they did to it. When he stopped returning my calls, they told me he must have slipped in a storm. But nothing about him was careless, Ezra. I've been coming back every winter, hoping I was wrong." She looked up at him with eyes that shone in the firelight, equal parts grief and steel. "I wasn't." Willow pressed her head against Harper's thigh, her cold nose nudging gently. Harper's hand found the Husky's fur without looking, fingers sinking into the thick coat as if anchoring herself to something living, loyal, real. Ezra rested a hand lightly on Harper's shoulder, the gesture hesitant but sure. "Then we're not walking away," he said. "Not from this. Not from him." For the first time since she'd walked into the cabin, a small, fragile smile touched Harper's lips, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but real. Night outside thickened, the temperature dropping until the windows frosted at the corners. They decided, wordlessly, mutually, to stay in the cabin, Ezra stoking the fire higher while Harper carefully repacked the journal, map, and vials back into the box to protect them from the cold. The ridge seemed to hold its breath around them, as if listening. Morning came with a brittle, cloudless sky and air so sharp it felt like glass in the lungs. Ezra had just stepped out onto the porch when the quiet was broken by a sound that didn't belong to the wilderness at all. The smooth purr of a high-end engine climbing the rough trail like it had never seen mud a day in its life. A dark SUV rolled into the clearing, chrome catching the weak winter sun. It stopped with absolute confidence, tires barely splashing the slush. The man who climbed out was dressed for winter, in the kind of way rich men did. Thick wool coat trimmed with fur at the collar, gloves too soft to have ever chopped wood, boots clean enough to mirror his reflection. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair combed back, and a face trained into a practiced, easy smile that didn't quite reach his pale blue eyes. The air around him carried the faint scent of expensive cologne, jarringly out of place amid pine and smoke. "Mr. Mallory," he called, like speaking to an old acquaintance, not a stranger. "Marcus Blackwell. I run North Star Extraction." He approached the porch with the casual dominance of a man used to owning not just land, but the people standing on it. "Heard you picked up this little patch of the world for a song. Congratulations." Ezra stepped down one plank, Willow at his side, her tail level, her gaze fixed. "News travels fast," he said evenly. "In a small county. It flies," Marcus replied, smile never wavering. "Look, I'll get straight to it. This cabin and the surrounding acreage, let's call it a neat $80,000 cash. You walk away with a profit, I get a logistical headache off my books. Everyone wins." He said it like he was offering Ezra a warm coat, not trying to buy the ground beneath his feet. Ezra didn't need to think. The answer was already sitting on the table inside, bound in leather and filled with Arthur Sloane's handwriting. "Not interested," he said. Marcus tilted his head as if he'd misheard. "Sure you don't want to sleep on it? 80 grand is a lot of reasons to reconsider a piece of frozen history." Ezra met his gaze, steady as bedrock. "I said no." For a heartbeat, the mountain air went razor thin. Then the smile slipped, just a fraction, and something harder showed through, impatience, entitlement, a flicker of annoyance that anyone would dare say no to him. "You know," Marcus said, his tone cooling a few degrees, "out here, bad investments have a way of turning into unfortunate stories. Sometimes it's better not to hold on too tight." Willow's chest rumbled with a low, warning growl that vibrated through Ezra's boot soles. Marcus glanced at her with thinly veiled distaste, then back at Ezra. "Enjoy your stay, Mr. Mallory," he said, turning to his SUV. "Weather can change fast up here." The threat hung in the air long after the sound of his engine faded down the trail. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of old bruises, and the wind began to claw at the eaves of the cabin. Harper, who had spent the day cross-checking coordinates on Arthur's map with her own notes, listened to the weather report crackling from a small battery-powered radio. "They're calling it a fast-moving front," she said, frowning. "Heavy snow, high winds. They're telling people to stay off the roads." Ezra glanced at the door, then at the box on the table. We weren't going anywhere tonight anyway. By the time darkness settled, the storm had arrived in full, snow slamming sideways against the windows, wind howling through the trees like some old, impatient spirit. The cabin creaked and groaned, but the logs held. Ezra and Harper sat close to the fire, the box within reach. Willow stretched between them like a living barrier. The world beyond those walls felt distant, but not distant enough. It started as a feeling more than a sound, a shift in Willow's breathing, the way her head lifted, ears pricked, body going from relaxed to coiled in the span of a heartbeat. Then came the crunch, faint but deliberate beneath the roar of the wind, footsteps in deep snow, circling. Willow moved to the door, hackles raised, teeth bared in a silent snarl. Ezra's hand went instinctively to the old rifle leaning by the hearth, the motions practiced but never eager. Harper's fingers closed around his forearm, tight.
"Someone's out there," she whispered,
Though they both knew that already. The rattle at the lock confirmed it. Metal scraped metal, slow and careful. Someone working the mechanism with tools, not brute force. Ezra reached up and pinched the flame from the oil lamp, plunging the room into a darkness lit only by the faint glow of embers in the fireplace. The storm outside became a deafening ocean, but inside the cabin, the silence was taut, listening. Harper trembled, the fear real and immediate, not the abstract dread she'd carried for years. Ezra covered her hand with his free one, leaning close enough that his words were meant for her alone. "I won't let them touch you," he said, voice low and certain. "Trust me." Her grip tightened. It was all the answer he needed. The lock gave with a soft, traitorous click, and the door eased inward against the weight of the wind. A figure outlined itself in the gap, tall, bulky, faceless beneath a hood and mask. Before he could fully enter, Willow launched herself like a silver bullet, slamming the door with her body and knocking it wide open so that snow and wind exploded into the room, swallowing the intruder's curse. Ezra yanked Harper behind an overturned table he had dragged near the hearth earlier, just in case, and the world dissolved into shadows and shapes. Willow's snarl, the man's shouted order into the storm, a second set of footsteps rushing the porch. There was a muffled cry, a thud, and then only the sound of retreating boots scrambling in the snow as Willow drove them back with a fury that owed nothing to training and everything to loyalty. Marcus Blackwell, Ezra realized, hadn't just been making idle threats. He'd sent men who knew how to work in the dark and planned to leave nothing behind but ashes and questions. When the immediate danger ebbed, they regrouped by the fire, breathing hard. The storm had turned the clearing into a white void, no shapes, no vehicles, just the sense that eyes still watched from the tree line. Ezra knew they couldn't simply bunker down and hope for morning. "If they want the evidence," he said, "they'll come harder next time." He looked at Harper, at Willow, and felt the decision rise like something the mountain itself had already made. "You're taking the proof out," he told her. "Willow will lead you through the trees. I'll keep their attention here." Harper shook her head instantly, eyes shining with panic and anger. "No, I'm not leaving you. You don't know what these people are capable of, Ezra. They've already taken Arthur. I can't." Her voice broke. He reached up, cupping her cheek with a hand rough from years of work and war, gentler than she could have imagined. "For a long time, I thought there wasn't a place left in this world that wanted me," he said. "But tonight, you and that box gave me something worth standing for again. Let me hold this line. You get his truth out." Willow gave a low, mournful howl that rose and fell like some old mountain song, then licked Harper's wrist as if sealing a pact. Outside, the storm flared even wilder, snow flashing white against the dark as if the sky itself had split open. The moment the hired men regrouped and charged again, something else answered. From the ridge above the cabin, a sudden, unnatural green light burst to life, a sharp, pulsing beam that cut through the veil of snow and fog like a sword. The intruders stopped short, curses turning to startled shouts as the light swept over them. Harper's eyes widened with dawning recognition. "The sensor," she whispered. Months ago, she had installed a remote environmental monitor on that very slope, rigged with a prototype warning system to respond when certain chemical signatures spiked in the snowmelt. Somewhere out in the blizzard, their own spilled toxins had finally tripped it. Now it cast its accusatory glow across the clearing, filling the night with an eerie, otherworldly radiance that made the men flinch and look wildly toward the road, certain that law enforcement must be seconds away. "They think they've been seen," Ezra said, the corners of his mouth tightening. "That's our opening." In the confusion, with the men shouting into radios and stumbling backward through the drifts, Ezra pushed open the back window and boosted Harper out into the waist-deep snow. Willow leapt after her, landing sure-footed despite the chaos, ears flat but eyes bright. "Follow the tree line west," Ezra told Harper, his voice barely audible above the storm. "You know the way better than I do. Get to town. Get to someone who will listen." Harper caught his hand, squeezing once, her face inches from his, the green light painting both of them in a ghostly hue. "Come back to me," she said, and then she was gone. Willow bounding ahead, a streak of white-gray against the dark trunks, guiding her into the sheltering arms of the forest while the ridge's strange, emerald warning pulsed overhead like a watchful eye. The next day dawned quieter, the storm spent, the ridge wrapped in a hush that felt almost reverent. In Tall Pine Junction, Harper stood in a cramped federal field office, her hair still damp from melted snow, Willow pressed obediently against her leg. Across from her sat a mid-level agent from the Environmental Protection Agency, a woman with tired eyes and a no-nonsense jawline who had seen too many poisoned rivers and sick children to be shocked easily. But as Harper laid out Arthur Sloane's journal, the maps, the labeled vials, and her own corroborating data, something in the agent's expression shifted from routine skepticism to hard, focused attention. "This isn't just negligence," the woman said finally, tapping a finger against one of the lab codes. "This is a pattern. And this Marcus Blackwell of yours just became a very interesting name on a very long list." Investigations, Harper knew, would take time, but for the first time since Arthur vanished, the burden of proof was no longer hers alone. When she drove back up to Lone Aspen Ridge under a calmer sky, the cabin bore the scars of the night before: splintered wood near the door, tracks half filled by drifting snow, the lingering smell of fear and smoke. Ezra stood out front, shoulders squared, Willow leaning into his leg as if she'd been there when he needed her most. And she had. The box was empty now, its contents safely in federal hands, but Arthur Sloane's presence felt stronger than ever, woven into the mountainside itself. Harper walked up, her boots crunching softly, and stopped beside Ezra. Without a word, she slipped her hand into his. He looked down at their joined fingers, then out at the valley where the snow-covered streams lay quiet, waiting to heal. "Are you leaving Lone Aspen Ridge?" she asked softly. It was a simple question, but it held all the years he'd spent drifting, all the places he hadn't been able to stay. Ezra let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in his chest since the day he left the service. A slow, rare smile tugged at his mouth. "No," he said. "I'm going to rebuild this place. Make it something worth the fight it took to keep it. If you'd like, you could stay. This ridge could use someone who speaks its language." Harper's answering smile was small but sure, and when she nodded, Willow barked once, sharp and bright, the sound echoing off the trees like a blessing. As snowflakes began to drift lazily from a clearing sky, the three of them stood together before the battered cabin. a veteran who finally had a reason to root himself, a scientist who had kept faith with a lost friend, and a husky whose loyalty had stitched their separate lives into one quiet, stubborn miracle. In the heart of the Montana wilderness, where so many secrets had been buried under ice and silence, they had found something neither money nor fear could buy: a place to belong. In the end, Ezra learned something the mountains had been whispering all along. Sometimes, God works in ways we do not see until the danger has passed and the snow has settled. A light in the storm, a loyal dog that refuses to leave our side, a stranger who becomes family by simply choosing to stay. These are the quiet miracles that hold our lives together when we feel most alone. And maybe that is the lesson for all of us. In our daily battles and in the hidden valleys of our hearts, God still sends guidance in forms we might overlook. A gentle warning, a person who shows up right when we need them, a path that opens only when we are brave enough to follow it. Even in the coldest winters of our lives, His presence can warm a place we thought was lost forever. If this story touched you, I invite you to share it with someone who needs a reminder that hope is never too far. Leave a comment and tell us what part of the story spoke to your heart
today. And if you would like to join us for more mountain tales of faith, courage, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and everyone watching, and may His quiet miracles find you wherever your journey leads.